We're going to be talking about incremental hook migration in React components. Special thank you goes out to anyone from the West Coast who's tuning in right now for the morning sessions. I got 2 hours on you, so y'all are the real MVPs. Thank you all for being here. A bit about myself. My name is Rosalind Wills. I am a software developer. I've been a developer for about 10 years now. For the last 3 years, I've been working as a software consultant in Chicago, Illinois, and recently began working as an engineer at Automatic, where I'll be specializing in React and JavaScript development, which is the part of web that I'm really the most excited about. You can follow me on Twitter at BlackjackKent. I tweet a lot about software and web development. I also tweet about video games and live streaming and my cat. So it's a guarantee there's always going to be something nerdy going on there. And I'm always open to geeking out about this stuff. So if you have questions about anything I talk about today or anything else for that matter, please feel free to hit me up there. This talk is in the JavaScript track. So for those of you working on the front end, JavaScript interfaces for all these CMS-driven sites. And specifically, we're going to be talking about React hooks. They've been around in React for about a year and a half. But this talk is specifically about approaching your existing application. It's been around for a while, how you would go about migrating it incrementally to start making use of these more modern React features. A quick rundown of what hooks are for those of you who are less familiar with them. Hooks were introduced in React 16.8 in February of 2019. The release announcement was titled 16.8, the one with hooks. So it was very hotly anticipated by the community. And at base, hooks are just JavaScript functions. They are specifically functions that are built into the React library, core library, which can be used to provide behavior in a functional component that was formerly only possible in a class component. It plugs into the component lifecycle and allows you to do things like component state, managing permanent state values in a React component that you previously could only do with class components. But at heart, they're just JavaScript functions that are being used in a specific way within the React lifecycle. So why React hooks? Why should you update components in your application to start using hooks? Hooks make it easier to extract your logic from a component and test and reuse it independently. They're designed to facilitate code abstraction and reuse. So you can extract this logic that is recurring throughout your application, test it in isolation, reuse it independently of specific components that are using it. This simplifies your application architecture by allowing your code to be organized based on behavior rather than lifecycle. So in other words, you can group code that manages similar functionality together in your application architecture, even if it's used in very disparate places in your application from the perspective of your user's experience. And make it easier to write React in a simple, succinct, and approachable way. There's a lower barrier to entry with hooks for new developers who will likely find the functional JavaScript syntax easier to understand and interpret than a more elaborate class component syntax. And functional components are also easier for tools like ahead-of-time compilers to process to enable more elaborate tooling and that sort of thing that can make our jobs more fun and simple. So those are some reasons why you might want to be considering this for a more long-standing React project that's been around for a while. Are hooks required? Do I have to use hooks in my long-standing application? Absolutely not. Hooks are fully backwards compatible in the React ecosystem. There are no plans to remove class-based components from React core. So there's no need to worry that your existing class-based components are going to become obsolete or stop working in the future with an update to React. And hooks were built with the intention of being used side by side with class components in the ongoing development of an application. In fact, React's devs actively recommend not trying to migrate an entire code base at once. You want to work on components as they become relevant to work that you're already doing, and without having to necessarily make an entire code base wide initiative to make this transition to a new syntax all at once. Basically, hooks make use of the same features and concepts that have always been part of React, but are a more succinct, direct way to implement these concepts with a more streamlined syntax. This slide and the next one are an overview of the built-in hooks that are default out of the box in React Core. This first slide are probably the ones that you're going to run into most often. Use state is probably the most common one. Basically is connected to the this.state that you would be using in a React class component. It establishes a stateful value as well as a function that will be used to update that value over the course of the application or the course of the component's life. Use effect is going to hold a lot of functionality that was previously used in your class component methods, like component did update, component will receive props, that sort of thing. It establishes a function that runs after each completed render or when certain values have changed within the component's lifecycle. Use context makes use of the React Context API to establish a context object in a functional component that was passed from further up the component tree to be able to share values and information across your application as a whole. Use reducer will be somewhat familiar to those of you who are familiar with Redux. It basically is used for calculating and deriving a more complicated state than the single values that use state is good for. So you can basically create a reducer function that takes in an action and is used to update a more complicated state object accordingly. Use memo is for memoization situations where you need memoization in a React component. So that's caching the results of a complex calculation for a particular set of inputs so that you don't have to keep running the calculation over and over again. Moving on, we have use callback, which is used to provide a callback function that gets called when certain inputs change. Use ref and use imperative handle are connected to the ref property that you might have seen in HTML as you're doing, or JSX rather, as you're doing React development. Use layout effect is similar to use effect. It fires code synchronously after all DOM mutations performed by a component. Usually it's not necessary. You will probably be able to use effect all by itself for anything in that regard, but it's good to have this as another option. And then use debug status is a debug specific hook, which is used to provide debugging information inside your dev tools for when you're creating your own custom hooks. And you can indeed take these built-in hooks and build on top of them and create your own hooks that can also plug into the application's lifecycle and abstract and isolate your code in whatever architecture you would like. As I mentioned, these are the built-in hooks as part of the React core library. Not all of them are going to be particularly common. The ones in the previous slide are probably the ones you're going to see most often. So hopefully this overview gives you some context for the whole situation. And with all this, we're going to do a demonstration of a very, very simple React application that I've spun up and how you might go about migrating it in an incremental way to start making use of these new syntax options. We're not going to cover all of these hooks in the built-in API, but we're going to be covering a few important ones, specifically the ones that React's documentation identifies as the sort of basic central hooks, which are probably the ones that you're going to run into most often in the course of migrating an existing application. So we're going to be looking at use state, use effect, and use context. So we're going to close out of this, and we're going to switch over to our application here. And I'll pull up the app first and give you the general overview. So this is my very complex application, as you can tell, and basically has a few simple specific behaviors that are going to be used to demonstrate some of the behaviors that we're going to want to wrap in hooks. So we have a name input here where I can type a name and it will update the state value of the name and display it here. We have a counter, which is used to increment and decrement, and so we can keep track of this state value here. And when we update this value, we also have a side effect, which I don't know if you can see on the video here, but it is updating our document title as well. So we have a side effect that's taking place when our state value is updated to update our title here. So it now says current count is 2, current count is 3, etc. And down here, we have another component here that is doing a theme change. So when we flick this button, it's going to change the theme of our buttons across multiple components of the application. And so this is the general behavior that we are going to try to maintain as we are refactoring this application. So we're going to go over and look at the code now. And this is, again, pretty straightforward. So we have, as you would expect, our app.js is going to be our entry point. And it's loading this counter container component, which is, hopefully this font is big enough, but let me know if I need to zoom in further. So our counter container is basically our wrapper component that is handling the, basically just wrapping the components that contain the majority of our application logic. But it does manage one state variable, which is our theme, which is controls the text color and background of those buttons that we saw in multiple of its child components. And then our 3 boxes with the various bits of behavior are managed by, we have a data inputs component here, which is manages our name input. So we take in our text input and update the state value of state.name. And we have our...
Rosalind, I just want to interrupt. I'm seeing the incremental hooks intro.
You are? That's extremely weird.
Is anybody else having that issue?
It's showing on my screen that...
So I might just have to leave and go back. Sorry to... let me refresh. Sorry about that.
I zoomed it in another point for the person who requested that in the chat. Cool. Okay. Yeah, if you are not seeing it, try refreshing to see if things update. But okay, so I'll back up a few steps here. So we have our app.js, which is taking in the counter container, which is our wrapper component, which wraps the majority of the application logic and manages the theme state value, which is going to be passed down to the various child components that use those buttons that need to be styled. And then we have our data inputs component, which is managing those two, here, I'll demonstrate, managing these 2 data input components. So it has a name state value and a count state value, both of which are updated by interfacing with these, or interacting with the text input and button input, respectively. And then we have our theme switcher component, which is our 3rd box down here. It has makes use of a button as well, and passes down an on-click handler to do our theme change, which is calling a method that updates our theme state component back up in our wrapper component. And then finally, down at the bottom of the component tree, we have this button class that you saw referenced in our data inputs and theme switcher. And this button component just takes in an on-click and text and takes in this theme property that was passed down all the way from the counter container to style the button appropriately. So hopefully that all makes sense. Happy to clarify anything about the initial starting point of the application. But this is the basic setup that we're going to work with, and we're going to try and maintain our functionality while incrementally migrating this to start making use of these hooks that we talked about. So as of right now, we have a number of things in this application that are currently dependent on these being class components. We're managing state, so we're managing the state in our data inputs with the name and the count. We're managing state with the theme. We have a side effect that's taking place where we're updating our document title when our state is updated. And we have this theme value that is being passed down and prop forwarded from our counter container, our container component, all the way down to our button components. So we're going to take a look at how we can migrate this functionality to make use of hooks and make these functional components instead. So we're going to start out with our data inputs.js because this is where our most significant logic is taking place. And so we have two state values here that are being managed, our count and our name. And our first step is going to be to change. If we're going to start using hooks to manage the state, our first step is just going to be to convert this from a class component into a functional one. So the process for that is fairly straightforward. We're going to change our signature here into a function signature. We're going to change our return value. We're just going to have a return value from this function component instead of a render method, because the whole thing is now one function with a return value of the rendered content. We're going to take our instance methods here, our instance method rather, that updates the name, and instead we're just going to make that another function that is called from within the scope of our functional component. And we have props that are being passed to this component of initial count, as well as the theme that's being passed down to our button class. But since this is a functional component, those props are just passed as parameters to the function. So let's go ahead and move those up here. And now we can remove references to this dot props and just reference those variables instead. And then we have our references to this dot state, which obviously this no longer exists as a concept since we're not in a class anymore, we're in a function. So we need to get rid of this dot state, and the way we're going to use that is by bringing in our first hook. So we're going to go use state, import that from React. And instead of all this stuff that's happening in the constructor, we're going to initialize these state values using the use state syntax, which looks like this. Boy, it'd be nice if I could type. That'd be great. There we go. Okay. And so basically the syntax is very straightforward. We call this useState function with the default value that we want this state value to have. And it returns an array, which we can destructure into two values here. The first one is going to be the actual value of the state state variable in its current render. And then the second parameter is going to be the function that is used to update this state value. So instead of having a this.setState that's used to update every state value in the component, we have an individual function that's used for each state value to render, to update it individually. So we now no longer need anything in this constructor because we've got our state values initialized. And we don't need component did mount either because use state is already setting our default value for the state state variable. And any place that we have reference to this dot state now, we can instead just get rid of that because these state values are now just individual variables. And instead of this dot set state, let's remove this because this is a standalone function now. Instead of this dot set state, we're going to make use of these set count and set name functions that are use of use state initialized. So we can go ahead and change this to set count and set count. And our update name function is going to be using update name. Set name rather. Set name. The name that was passed in. And now we can get rid of, we've gotten rid of pretty much everything that's making use of the original class component syntax. The only thing that we have left is component did update, which was responsible for doing that document title update when the count state value changed. Every time we clicked that increment button, it was updating the title of the document to say the current count is whatever. This, as we mentioned, is a side effect. And for side effects that are taking place when your state is updated, you're going to make use of the use effect hook, which is going to have different syntax, which looks like this. So we're going to wipe out component did update, and instead we're using use effect. And use effect takes in as its first parameter a function, and that function is going to run when the component re-renders. And with that, we have now reload this. We'll see that our functionality is exactly the same, but we've now converted this to be a stateful functional component that has a side effect firing off when a state value updates. And we've done this entirely incrementally. We've not touched any of the other class components in our architecture. We were able to do this completely centralized to this particular component. Everything works exactly the way it was before. Our syntax is very much more streamlined and I think easier to read and see exactly what's going on at a glance. And that's the general first step in this process for us. One further update that we can make to use effect here is, as mentioned, this functionality right now is running anytime that the component re-renders. And we're going to add a console login here to see when that's happening to get a little bit more clarity. And we're going to open up our developer tools here. And so we can see that use effect fired on the initial load of the application, which is what you would expect. Excuse me, since that's our first render. We can see that every time we are incrementing our state value, that use effect is firing off, which again is what we would expect. It's also firing off anytime I enter text in our name field, which is a little weird because our updating of the document title doesn't care at all about whether the name value has updated. And that's extra computation that we don't really need to be happening in this rendering process. So what you can do is you can actually add a second parameter here, which is a dependency array. And basically you can pass into this dependency array and tell it, I want this effect to only fire when this count variable has changed since the last render. Not any render, but just when this particular value has updated. And this can be very important in the process of making these modifications. You want to make sure that your hooks are only firing when you need them to. And this gives us a little bit more specificity in when this is happening. So once again, use effect fired as we expect when the component initially loads. It fires on each render when we're changing the count state value. But now, if I'm typing in our name value and updating that state value, use effect is not firing. So this is a little bit more, we've increased the specificity of when this is being made use of, basically, during the rendering process. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as you're doing these migrations of the side effects in your code to make use of hooks instead. So we've done a pretty good job with our data inputs component. I think that's looking a lot better. We've cleaned everything up pretty nicely. We haven't had to touch any of our surrounding code, but we're going to do a little bit more with that now. So this is an example of this incremental nature of this migration to make use of hooks. Can update components as they become relevant. So maybe I was doing work in this component already, and we're going to migrate it to use hooks while we're at it. We didn't have to update anything else in the component at all. However, we do have some stuff that we still want to improve in these other components here. And the main thing I want to talk about next is this theme value that is being used in our counter container, which is being currently passed down as a prop into our data inputs and theme switcher. And then from there, prop forwarded further down as a prop to the button component, which is then using it for styling. This is a solid use case for the use context hook, which is the third one of those three kind of base hooks that I talked about. And use context is all about using the React Context API to make values available throughout the component tree. The context object, which this hook provides, has two parts, a provider and a consumer. So you're going to create a provider, which is basically the source in your component tree of a particular value that you want to make available. And then your consumer is something further down the component tree that fetches that value and makes use of it. So for our purposes, we want this counter container to be our provider for a theme context, because that's where our theme and information is being initialized and it's being passed down the tree. And then our button component is going to be our consumer, because that is the class further down the component tree that retrieves that information and makes use of it to determine how to style itself. So we're going to start over here in our counter container. And before we can actually use the hook, we need to make use of the React Context API to create a context object. And so we're going to do that, making use of another function that is not technically a hook, but still useful, called, and it's going to look like this: export response theme context equals react.create context themes.type. And so what this is basically doing is initializing, is making use of this create context method from the React core library to create an object which contains a particular context value. In this case, we're calling it theme context, and we're giving it a default value of the light theme of the two that are defined in this enum up here. And we are exporting this so that we can make it available to import in another class, or component rather, which can then make use of this hook. We could also update this component to also use state hooks to manage its and turn this into a functional component as well, but we don't have to in this particular case. We can leave this here. I could totally run through that if you guys would like to see it, but you don't have to. And then we're going to go over to our button component, and this is where we want to make use of that context hook in order to be able to retrieve that value from. Sorry, I skipped a step. Backing up. We're still in the counter container. We've initialized this theme context object, and we need to make sure that that becomes available to values further down the component tree. And the way that we do that is there's a property on this theme context object called provider. And that provider property is a component provided by the React core library, which we'll use to wrap all the children of counter container. So it's going to look like this. In context provider, and we'll give it a value. State. And so basically what this is we're creating a wrapper, or we're pulling in a wrapper component that is going to wrap all of the children of our counter container. And so now all children of this component will be able to have access to this context, no matter how far down the component tree they are. And we're giving it a value, which is going to be our state theme value of the counter container. So whenever this this.state.theme is updated, it's going to also update the value of the context for any consumers further down the tree. Now that we've done that, we can move over to our button component, which is what is the consumer of this context. And we're going to import, first of all, use context from React, and we're going to import that theme context that we exported from our counter container. And we're once again going to convert this into a functional component so it can make use of hooks. So we're going to go ahead and change our syntax here. We're going to give it a functional signature. We're going to remove the render method and just have it return our render information. And we're going to take our props and destructure them as the parameters into this functional component. Already looking more clean, in my opinion. But instead of this theme parameter, we want to get our theme directly from this context. And the way that we're going to do that is const theme equals use context theme context. So what this basically does is it says we're going to look up the component tree and we're going to find a provider somewhere in our parents in the component tree that matches this context. And we're going to retrieve the value of that context. So we don't need this as a parameter anymore, as a property rather, because we're retrieving it directly from the theme context. And we also now don't need to prop forward through the intermediary components. Because our data inputs and our theme switcher don't actually care about this theme value at all to display themselves. They were just passing it along to the button. They don't care at all. So we can remove that. We can remove this as a property from these components and only make use of this theme value, taking it straight from counter container to button without the intermediaries having to be aware of it at all. And if we reload here, we'll see that the behavior is exactly the same. Once again, we've refactored very cleanly. We haven't had to make any changes to how to switch to full screen. Do you mean how to switch the video to full screen? I think if you double click on it, it will fully pull out the code window and get rid of my face. The sidebar is, you can up it next to time left, you can tab it over to, there's a little arrow button next to time left and that will close the sidebar. But yeah, so that, we've now made use of the use context hook and completely removed the dependence of our intermediary components on the theme value that was being passed down. We don't have to do that prop forwarding. Our button class is just making use of this context and any other elements of your application that needed to be aware of this theme value would also be able to, since it's being forwarded down from our container component that's actually responsible for managing that value. So that covers the three kind of central hooks that I wanted to go over. Since we have a little bit of time left, the final thing I want to talk about is how to create your own custom hooks to further isolate and abstract the recurring code that you might want to use across multiple areas of your application. So we have some functionality in this data inputs component here that might be potentially useful to other components at some point in our application. Let's say that we potentially want various elements of our application to be able to notify our document title when a state value changes. We can extract this state and effect management into its own hook that we can then use in multiple places in the application. So we're going to go ahead and create a new file here. We're going to, by custom, to show that it's a hook, we're going to start with that same use that the React built-in hooks use. So we're going to say use document title.js. And we're going to basically just establish it as, once again, hooks are just basically just JavaScript functions. So we're going to declare a JavaScript function here, document title, and export that. And we are going to take our existing state and effect management code that we have going on in in our data inputs class, and we're going to bring it over into use document title. instead, so that we can make this more generic to be used in potentially multiple multiple scenarios in the application. So in this case, for the code that we got from data inputs, we were managing a count variable specifically. But for use document title, we might be handling any number of potential values that we want to update the document title with. So we're going to take in two parameters here. We're going to take in the initial value and the value name. And we're going to change all of this to be a little bit more generic. So we're going to instead manage a state value that's just initial value, and we'll call this value and set value. We can use console log. And for our use effect, we will use our dependency of value, and we'll set document title to current value name is value. And then to maintain the signature of this hook in the same in the way that our potential consumers of it will be expecting, we can return value and set value. And so the signature of this is going to look very similar to one other thing. You want to make sure that you're importing your stuff from React that this is using. And so now we can make use of this over in our data inputs function, or sorry, component, exactly the same as we were using before. So we're going to, it's going to look very similar. We're going to call it const count set count equals use document title. So we're going to import that from our use document title, and we're going to say our default value is going to be that initial count, and our value name is going to be count. And that's like it once again. There we go. So now, once again, this is pretty much the same signature that we had from when we were just using state. But now we've condensed all of that code into this use document title, which we could potentially reuse in future components as well if we wanted them to also be able to update the document title. And once again, if we reload our component here, we'll see that it is still doing exactly what we said. Hopefully you can see that, but it is still updating. I promise it's true. It's still updating the document title exactly as we expected, but we've now abstracted that functionality out to a separate hook that can then be used in the future by other parts of your application. And with that, we've completely converted the functionality of this application to use hooks. We did it incrementally, touching components as we needed them. We streamlined our code for readability, for conciseness. Hopefully this gives you some ideas of how you can approach your own applications bit by bit to bring these tools into your code base. Obviously, there's a ton more hooks out there that might be useful to you. There's a ton of libraries that make use of these. I highly recommend checking out the React documentation for further information. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have here. And yeah, thank you for your time.